At 2:38 in the morning on January 17, 1991, a missile launched from a warship in the Red Sea hit a power station in downtown Baghdad, hundreds of miles inland, within meters of its intended impact point. The weapon had navigated itself across terrain it had never seen before, comparing radar signatures to stored maps and matching camera images to pre-programmed references, flying 50 feet above the ground at 550 miles per hour. Soviet military analysts watching from Moscow knew immediately that something fundamental had changed in the balance of military power. Within hours, the opening salvo would grow to 52 missiles fired from 9 American warships, each one finding its way to targets deep inside Iraqi territory, without human guidance, without radio control, without anything that Soviet doctrine considered necessary for accurate fire at long range. The USS San Jacinto, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser positioned in the Red Sea, had fired the first weapon to strike Baghdad in what would become Operation Desert Storm. Captain James Johnson and his weapons officers had loaded the target coordinates weeks earlier, programming a flight path that would take the missile across Saudi Arabia and into Iraq, weaving through predetermined waypoints at altitudes low enough to evade radar detection. The BGM-109 Tomahawk that left the ship's vertical launch system that morning carried a 1,000-pound warhead and a navigation computer that contained digitized terrain maps covering the entire route from launch point to target. When the solid rocket booster fell away after 7 seconds of flight, a small turbofan engine ignited and began pulling the missile through the night sky at subsonic speed, its wings unfolding automatically as it settled into cruise flight. The weapons team aboard San Jacinto had no way to track the missile once it disappeared over the horizon, no data link to monitor its progress, no confirmation that it had reached its target until intelligence reports filtered back hours later. Soviet military observers had been watching American cruise missile development for more than a decade, but most had dismissed the technology as expensive and limited in practical application. The missiles were slow, vulnerable to air defenses, and required extensive pre-mission planning that seemed incompatible with the fluid nature of modern warfare. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass and volume, the coordinated movement of thousands of artillery pieces and rocket launchers delivering overwhelming firepower on predetermined schedules. Precision-guided munitions existed in Soviet arsenals, but they were reserved for high-value targets and used sparingly because of their cost and complexity. The idea that an entire air campaign could be built around weapons that cost more than $1 million each and flew at speeds a jet fighter could easily intercept seemed to violate basic military economics. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov had tried to warn them. As chief of the Soviet General Staff in the early 1980s, Ogarkov had recognized that Western precision weapons represented a fundamental threat to Soviet conventional superiority. He had written extensively about what he called a revolution in military affairs, arguing that advances in reconnaissance, computing, and guidance technology would make it possible to increase the destructive potential of conventional weapons by an order of magnitude. Ogarkov believed that the Americans were developing a new family of highly accurate, precision-guided delivery systems that could achieve effects previously requiring nuclear weapons. His warnings had been noted, debated in closed military forums, and largely set aside by a high command that remained focused on tank armies and artillery concentrations. By the time Desert Storm began, Ogarkov had been out of his position for 7 years, reassigned after clashing with political leadership over military spending priorities. The Tomahawk cruise missile that struck Baghdad that January morning was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of American development work that had begun in 19... The US Navy had initiated the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile program as part of a broader effort to extend strike range beyond what carrier aircraft could achieve. Engineers at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, working under the direction of James Walker, had designed a weapon that could be launched from surface ships or submarines, fly itself to targets hundreds of miles away, and deliver warheads with accuracy measured in meters rather than kilometers. The technical challenges had been enormous. The missile needed to navigate without continuous external guidance, which meant it required an autonomous navigation system capable of updating its position throughout the flight. It needed to fly low enough to avoid radar detection, which meant it needed terrain-following capability and the ability to distinguish safe flight corridors from ground obstacles. It needed to be small enough to fit in standard ship-launched containers and submarine torpedo tubes, which constrained every dimension of its design. The first successful surface ship launch had occurred in March 1980 from USS Merrill, a Spruance-class destroyer operating off the California coast. 3 months later, USS Guittaro became the first submarine to successfully launch the weapon from a torpedo tube. By March 1983, the Tomahawk had been declared operational and entered US Navy service. The system that emerged from this development process measured 20 feet in length with wings that folded flat against the body until launch, allowing it to fit inside a 21-inch diameter canister. The missile weighed 3,238 pounds fully loaded, with most of that weight consisting of fuel for the F-107 turbofan engine and the 992-pound warhead in the nose section. What made the Tomahawk revolutionary was not its speed or its warhead size, both of which were modest by military standards, but its guidance system. The missile carried 3 overlapping navigation technologies that worked together to maintain accuracy over distances that would have been impossible for any previous cruise missile. The Tomahawk aided inertial navigation system, known as TENS, provided basic course guidance using gyroscopes and accelerometers to track the missile's position relative to its launch point. This system alone would have accumulated errors of several hundred meters over a 1,000-mile flight, making it useless for precision targeting. To correct these errors, the missile used terrain contour matching, called TERCOM, which compared radar altimeter readings to stored elevation maps. Every few minutes during flight, the missile would climb briefly, sweep its radar altimeter across the terrain below, and compare the resulting elevation profile to pre-programmed maps stored in its computer. If the terrain signature matched, the missile confirmed its position. If it didn't match, the missile calculated the position error and updated its navigation solution. For the final approach to the target, the missile switched to digital scene matching area correlation, abbreviated DSMAC, which used an electro-optical camera to capture images of the ground and compare them to stored reference images. The DSMAC system could achieve accuracy of 10 meters or better, allowing the missile to distinguish between buildings in the same city block. The combination of these 3 systems gave the Tomahawk a published accuracy of 12 feet circular error probable, meaning that half of all missiles fired would impact within 12 feet of the designated aim point. Soviet weapons designers understood the principles behind each of these technologies, but they had not integrated them into an operational weapon system that could be deployed at scale across an entire fleet. The American development of precision conventional weapons had accelerated dramatically in the late 1970s as part of a broader strategic response to Soviet numerical superiority in Central Europe. NATO planners had calculated that Warsaw Pact forces could mobilize more than 50,000 tanks for an assault on Western Europe, outnumbering NATO armor by ratios that made conventional defense problematic. The American answer had been the Assault Breaker program, initiated by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in 1978. Assault Breaker focused on using advanced reconnaissance systems, long-range strike capabilities, and precision-guided munitions to destroy Soviet rear echelon forces before they could reach the front lines. The concept was to use intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to locate Soviet tank columns and supply convoys, then hit them with precision weapons while they were still hundreds of miles from the battlefield. This approach required the integration of satellite reconnaissance, airborne radar systems, secure data networks, and weapons capable of hitting moving targets at long range. The Tomahawk was designed to fit into this operational concept as a weapon for striking fixed high-value targets deep in Soviet territory, targets like command bunkers, communications facilities, bridge choke points, and ammunition depots. The missile's subsonic speed made it vulnerable to fighter interception in contested airspace, but NATO planners believed that in the opening hours of a conflict, when air defenses would be overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous attacks, cruise missiles could penetrate to targets that would be too risky for manned aircraft. The missile's ability to fly at altitudes below 100 feet made it difficult to detect and track with ground-based radar. Its small radar cross-section meant that even when detected, it presented a challenging target for surface-to-air missiles designed to engage fast-moving aircraft. Soviet military theorists watching this development had split into 2 camps. Marshal Ogarkov and officers like Major General Ivan Vorobyev had argued that the Soviet Union needed to develop its own reconnaissance strike complexes, integrated networks of sensors and weapons that could achieve the kind of rapid, precise targeting the Americans were demonstrating. Vorobyev had written extensively about what he called URKS, systems that would link reconnaissance assets directly to strike platforms and enable near real-time target destruction. Other Soviet officers had been more skeptical, arguing that American precision weapons were too expensive, too complex, and too dependent on technology that might not work reliably in combat conditions. These officers pointed out that the Tomahawk cost more than $1 million per missile, compared to perhaps a few $1,000s for an artillery shell. They argued that for the cost of one cruise missile, the Soviet Union could fire thousands of artillery rounds, and that volume of fire would be more effective than precision in most combat scenarios. The Soviet preference for mass over precision reflected both doctrinal preferences and industrial capabilities. Soviet military doctrine emphasized coordinated operations across large formations, with carefully planned timetables and predetermined objectives. This approach, sometimes called mutant maneuver warfare by Western analysts, required units to adhere to schedules and execute assigned tasks in sequence, with each phase of an operation depending on the successful completion of the previous phase. Precision weapons that could be retargeted dynamically, or that required extensive pre-mission planning, didn't fit well into this doctrinal framework. Soviet industry, meanwhile, had proven highly capable of producing large quantities of relatively simple, robust weapons. but struggled with the miniaturized electronics and precision manufacturing required for advanced guidance systems. The microcomputer revolution that had transformed American military technology in the 1980s had not penetrated Soviet military industry to anything like the same degree. By the mid-1980s, Soviet authorities had concluded that the threat of NATO aggression had been significantly curtailed because of Soviet conventional buildups in Eastern Europe. Intelligence assessments suggested that the military balance had shifted in favor of the Warsaw Pact, and that NATO would be unable to halt a determined Soviet offensive without resorting to nuclear weapons. This conclusion had been comforting to Soviet military leadership, but it had also created a sense of complacency about Western technological developments. Soviet planners recognized that the favorable situation was unlikely to last indefinitely as Western technology continued to advance, but there was little urgency about matching American developments in precision weaponry. The Soviet Union was investing heavily in its own military modernization, but the focus remained on tanks, artillery, and tactical aircraft rather than on reconnaissance strike integration. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Soviet military observers paid close attention to the American buildup in Saudi Arabia. Iraq had been a major customer for Soviet military equipment over the previous 2 decades, and Iraqi forces were equipped primarily with Soviet-designed tanks, artillery, aircraft, and air defense systems. The Soviet military establishment watched with interest as American forces deployed to the Persian Gulf, curious to see how American doctrine and technology would perform against an opponent using Soviet equipment and Soviet-inspired tactics. There was concern in Moscow about how Soviet military hardware would be perceived if it performed poorly, but there was also a sense that the Americans were facing a formidable challenge. Iraq had the 4th largest army in the world, with battle-hardened troops that had fought Iran for 8 years. Iraqi air defenses around Baghdad were among the most concentrated on Earth, with more surface-to-air missile batteries than had defended Hanoi during the Vietnam War. The air campaign that began on January 17th exceeded anything Soviet observers had anticipated in scale, coordination, and technological sophistication. In the opening hours, American and coalition forces launched more than 100 aircraft in coordinated strikes against Iraqi air defenses, command and control facilities, and strategic targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait. The 52 Tomahawk missiles fired in the first salvo were only one element of this assault, but they were the element that struck Soviet observers as most significant. The missiles had been launched from warships positioned hundreds of miles from their targets, in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. They had flown themselves across terrain that included mountains, desert, and urban areas. They had navigated without any guidance from their launch platforms, without any radio signals that could be jammed or intercepted, without any human input after launch. And they had hit their targets with accuracy that Soviet analysts could barely credit. USS Paul F. Foster, a Spruance-class destroyer, had fired the first salvo of missiles 17 seconds after USS San Jacinto's initial launch. The battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, massive warships that had been built during World War II and repeatedly modernized, launched their own Tomahawks shortly afterward. These battleships, each displacing more than 58,000 tons fully loaded, had been equipped with Tomahawk launch systems as part of the Reagan administration's 600-ship Navy program. The sight of these vessels firing cruise missiles represented a symbolic link between industrial-age naval power and information-age precision strike. Within the first 48 hours of the campaign, the Navy had fired 216 Tomahawks at targets throughout Iraq. The targets struck by these missiles included electrical generation plants that powered Iraqi command and control systems, communications facilities that coordinated air defense networks, and government buildings that housed military command centers. The missiles flew programmed routes that had been planned weeks in advance by mission planners, who used satellite imagery and intelligence reports to map terrain features and identify potential obstacles. Each route included multiple waypoints where the missile would update its position using TERCOM, and a final approach phase where DSMAC would provide terminal guidance. The mission planning process was complex and time-consuming, requiring detailed terrain data and careful route selection to avoid terrain features that might confuse the TERCOM system or areas where air defenses were concentrated. On January 19th, USS Louisville, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, became the first submarine in history to launch a cruise missile against an enemy target in combat. The submarine had been submerged in the Red Sea when it received the order to launch. Tomahawks stored in the submarine's torpedo room were loaded into torpedo tubes and launched using compressed air, just like conventional torpedoes. The missile's protective capsule separated after leaving the tube, and the missile itself broke the surface and ignited its booster rocket, climbing rapidly before settling into cruise flight. For the submarine crew, the launch was a vindication of years of training and testing. For Soviet naval officers monitoring the campaign, it was a demonstration that the American submarine fleet, already the most capable in the world, now had a conventional strike capability that extended hundreds of miles inland from the coast. Soviet analysts preparing their assessment of the campaign struggled to find appropriate historical comparisons. The official report characterized the conflict as being without analogue since World War II, a striking admission given the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and numerous other conflicts that had occurred in the intervening decades. What made Desert Storm unique was the stunning integration of high-technology reconnaissance and furious strike forces, in the words of the Soviet assessment. American forces had demonstrated an ability to detect, identify, track, and strike targets with a speed and precision that Soviet doctrine had not anticipated. The Americans had detected Iraqi Scud missile launchers within 30 seconds and had responded with strikes that destroyed launch vehicles before they could relocate. This kind of responsive targeting required sensor networks, communication systems, and decision-making processes that the Soviet military had not developed. Lieutenant General A.I. Yevseev, a senior Soviet military theorist, made a statement that was unprecedented in Soviet doctrinal literature. He wrote that the main content of the initial period of war could be the delivery by belligerents of nuclear strikes or strikes with conventional means of destruction for achieving the war's main objectives. The inclusion of conventional weapons in this formulation was revolutionary. For decades, Soviet doctrine had held that only nuclear weapons could achieve decisive war aims in the initial period of a conflict. The idea that conventional precision weapons could accomplish the same objectives fundamentally undermined the assumptions on which Soviet military planning had been based. Yevseev explicitly stated that the Allies had achieved nuclear effects in the initial period by using high-tech conventional weapons. General Viv Lobov, Chief of Staff of the Warsaw Pact, expressed concern that the Gulf War would give NATO an unfair advantage in future conflicts. He noted that the Warsaw Pact would soon disappear, but NATO would remain, which meant there was no longer any parity between the two alliance systems. Lobov's statement reflected a broader anxiety within the Soviet military establishment about the implications of what they had witnessed. Graham E. Fuller, vice chairman of the CIA's National Intelligence Council, summarized the Soviet perspective in summer 1991 by noting that even in the best light, the Soviet military did not look good in the encounter. The campaign had exposed the limitations of Soviet air defenses, the obsolescence of Soviet military doctrine, and the inferiority of Soviet military hardware, much of which had been purchased by Iraq over the previous 2 decades. The performance of specific American weapons systems had made deep impressions on Soviet observers. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, which struck 40% of strategic targets in the first 3 days of the campaign, despite representing less than 3% of coalition aircraft, demonstrated that American stealth technology was operational and effective. The aircraft had flown missions over downtown Baghdad in darkness, striking targets in the most heavily defended airspace in the world, and had suffered no losses. Soviet radar operators who had proven themselves capable against the U-2 spy plane in 1960 discovered they could not track an aircraft designed from the beginning to evade radar detection. The psychological impact of this capability on Soviet air defense planners was profound. But it was the Tomahawk that represented the most fundamental challenge to Soviet military thinking. The missile's combination of range, accuracy, and autonomous operation meant that American naval forces could strike targets deep inside hostile territory without putting pilots at risk and without requiring access to nearby airbases. A single American surface action group, consisting of a few cruisers and destroyers, could deliver dozens of precision strikes against targets hundreds of miles inland. An American submarine operating alone could launch 12 Tomahawks and then disappear back into the ocean depths before anyone knew where the attack had come from. This capability undermined the Soviet concept of rear area security and made it impossible to protect high-value targets through distance alone. USS Fife, a Spruance-class destroyer, established a record by firing 58 Tomahawks during the 42-day campaign, more than any other ship in the fleet. The destroyer had been equipped with the Mark 41 vertical launch system, a modular launcher that could accommodate different types of missiles in standardized cells. The system could launch missiles in rapid succession, with intervals of less than 1 second between launches if required. For the crew of USS Fife, the sustained launching of missiles over several weeks demonstrated the reliability and maintainability of the Tomahawk system. For Soviet naval officers, it demonstrated that American warships could sustain high-tempo operations over extended periods, something that Soviet vessels struggled to achieve. The accuracy of the Tomahawk strikes varied, depending on terrain and target characteristics. In areas with distinctive terrain features, where mountains or rivers provided clear reference points for TERCOM navigation, the missiles performed exceptionally well. Targets in downtown Baghdad, where the urban landscape provided high-contrast images for DSMAC matching, were hit with remarkable precision. But in the flat, featureless deserts of western Iraq, where terrain variations were minimal and sand dunes shifted with the wind, some missiles had difficulty maintaining accurate navigation. Several Tomahawks drifted off course in these areas, and at least 2 were reportedly shot down by Iraqi air defenses. The limitations were real, but they did not diminish the overall impact of the weapon system. Soviet military analysts noted the proficiency of responsive strikes that American forces demonstrated throughout the campaign. The integration of reconnaissance assets, from satellites to E-3 AWACS radar aircraft to battlefield sensors, with strike platforms created what Soviet theorists had been calling reconnaissance strike complexes. The Americans had accomplished practical testing of these concepts under combat conditions, something the Soviet Union had never been able to do. The speed with which American forces could detect a target, generate targeting data, assign a weapon, and execute a strike created a tempo of operations that Soviet forces would have difficulty matching even if they had equivalent technology. The cost-effectiveness of the Tomahawk was debated extensively in both American and Soviet military circles after the war. Each missile cost between $1.1 and $1.6 million in 1991 dollars, making it one of the most expensive conventional weapons in the American arsenal. The warhead, at 992 pounds, was relatively small compared to bombs that aircraft could deliver. Critics pointed out that for the cost of one Tomahawk, the military could purchase thousands of artillery shells or dozens of conventional bombs. But defenders of the system argued that these comparisons missed the point. The value of the Tomahawk was not in its warhead size, but in its ability to put that warhead precisely where it needed to be, at a time of American choosing, without requiring air superiority or putting pilots at risk. A target destroyed by a single Tomahawk in the opening minutes of a conflict might be worth more strategically than 100 targets destroyed by artillery later. The overall statistics from Desert Storm revealed that precision weapons remained a small fraction of the total ordnance used. Of the 88,500 tons of bombs dropped during the 42-day campaign, only 8% were guided munitions. But those guided munitions represented 84% of the total cost of all ordnance expended, reflecting their expense relative to conventional bombs. An unguided bomb cost an average of $649, while a laser-guided bomb cost $30,000 or more, a ratio of roughly 1 to 47. An infrared-guided Maverick missile cost approximately $102,000, a ratio of 1 to 157 compared to unguided munitions. The effectiveness of precision weapons was also more nuanced than initial reports suggested. A post-war analysis by the Government Accountability Office and the Center for Naval Analysis found that actual hit rates were significantly below what the Department of Defense had initially claimed. The DoD had reported a 98% launch system success rate for the Tomahawk and suggested that 80% of FR-117 strikes had hit their targets. The classified GAO analysis found that performance was well below the impression conveyed in DoD's report. Only a deleted percentage of Tomahawks had actually hit or damaged their intended aim points, though a higher percentage had arrived over the intended target area. The distinction was significant because arriving over a target area was not the same as hitting a specific building or structure. Despite these limitations, the strategic impact of precision weapons on Soviet military thinking was undeniable. Soviet observers concluded that their forces would be behind for years in developing comparable capabilities. One American military officer, commenting on the Soviet assessment, noted simply that it's obvious that we have it, they don't have it, and they don't like it. The comment captured the asymmetry that had emerged between American and Soviet military capabilities. The United States had invested decades of research, billions of dollars, and the full capacity of its microelectronics industry in developing precision strike capabilities. The Soviet Union, hampered by an inefficient centrally planned economy and technological isolation from Western advances, had not kept pace. The timing of Desert Storm's conclusion in late February 1991, just 10 months before the collapse of the Soviet Union in December, meant that the lessons of the campaign were absorbed by a Soviet military establishment that was already in crisis. The economic problems that had prompted Mikhail Gorbachev's reform efforts had intensified, and the Soviet government was struggling to maintain funding for basic military operations, let alone for ambitious modernization programs. The revelation that Soviet military doctrine and equipment were inadequate for modern warfare came at a moment when there was no political will and no economic capacity to address the problem. Many in the Soviet security apparatus would never forgive the Soviet Union's loss in the Cold War, and the Gulf War became symbolic of that loss in the military sphere. The Tomahawk strikes on Baghdad had achieved more than their immediate tactical objectives. They had demonstrated to the world, and particularly to Soviet military planners, that the United States had developed a capability to project precision conventional firepower at strategic ranges. This was not a marginal improvement in existing capabilities, but a fundamental change in the nature of military power, A nation that could destroy targets hundreds or thousands of miles from its territory, with accuracy measured in meters, using weapons that required no human guidance after launch, had achieved a level of military effectiveness that previous generations would have thought impossible without nuclear weapons. The technical achievements underlying the Tomahawk's performance in Desert Storm reflected broader American advantages in computing, manufacturing, and systems integration. The missile's guidance computer, though primitive by later standards, represented the leading edge of miniaturized military electronics in the early 1990s. The TERCOM and DSMAC systems required precise sensors, fast processors, and algorithms that could match radar or optical signatures in real time. The missile's turbofan engine needed to operate reliably for hours while consuming minimal fuel. The warhead needed to survive the missile's low-altitude flight through turbulence and temperature variations. Every component needed to work together seamlessly, without any opportunity for maintenance or adjustment after launch. Soviet engineers who examined captured or crashed Tomahawk components after the war found themselves studying devices that represented multiple generations of advancement beyond comparable Soviet systems. The level of miniaturization, the quality of manufacturing, the sophistication of the software, all indicated an industrial and technological capability that the Soviet system could not match. This was not a matter of Soviet engineers lacking theoretical knowledge or understanding of the principles involved. Soviet science had produced remarkable achievements in mathematics, physics, and engineering, but the translation of scientific knowledge into mass-produced, reliable, operational weapons systems required an industrial infrastructure that the Soviet economy had not developed. The Tomahawk program itself illustrated the American approach to military technology development. General Dynamics had begun as the prime contractor in the 1970s and had served as the sole supplier initially. McDonnell Douglas had taken over as sole supplier from 1992 to 1994. Hughes Aircraft purchased General Dynamics' missile division in 1992 and outbid McDonnell Douglas in 1994 to become the new sole supplier. Raytheon acquired Hughes in 1997 and became the manufacturer going forward. This succession of corporate ownership changes reflected the competitive nature of the American defense industry, where companies bid against each other for production contracts and ownership shifted based on business considerations. The competition drove innovation and efficiency in ways that the Soviet system, with its state-owned design bureaus and production facilities, could not replicate. The submarines that launched Tomahawks in Desert Storm represented another dimension of American technological superiority. USS Louisville and USS Pittsburgh were Los Angeles-class attack submarines, vessels designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare but equipped to launch cruise missiles as a secondary mission. These submarines were among the quietest ever built, virtually undetectable by Soviet sonar when operating at low speeds. The addition of Tomahawk strike capability meant that American submarines could now threaten land targets throughout the Soviet Union, attacking from positions in international waters where Soviet forces could not locate them. The psychological impact on Soviet naval planners was significant, as they realized that their entire coastal infrastructure and much of their interior was now vulnerable to submarine-launched strikes. By the end of Desert Storm, 16 U.S. Navy surface ships and 2 submarines had fired a total of 288 Tomahawks. 6 missiles had suffered boost failures, failing to transition properly from rocket boost to turbofan cruise. 19 missiles had experienced pre-launch problems, though 10 of these were resolved and the missiles were fired later. The launch system success rate approached 98%, an impressive figure for a weapon system in its first large-scale combat use. The fact that the missiles could be launched from such diverse platforms, from decades-old battleships to modern cruisers to submarines, demonstrated the flexibility of the system and the effectiveness of the vertical launch system that Lockheed Martin had developed for surface ships. The battleship launches had particular symbolic resonance. USS Missouri, which had hosted the Japanese surrender ceremony that ended World War II, launched Tomahawks against Iraq on January 17, 1991, creating a visual connection between America's triumph in the last global conventional war and its demonstration of precision strike capability in the first post-Cold War conflict. USS Wisconsin, which had provided gunfire support in Korea and Vietnam, fired its own Tomahawks from the Persian Gulf, adding its weight to the bombardment of Iraqi targets. The battleship's 16-inch guns, which could hurl 2,700-pound shells more than 20 miles, represented the ultimate expression of industrial-age firepower. The Tomahawk missiles they now carried represented the information age that had succeeded it. The air defense environment over Baghdad during Desert Storm was among the most challenging that American weapons had ever faced. The city was defended by more than 65% of Iraq's surface-to-air missiles and over half of its anti-aircraft artillery, creating a concentration of firepower that exceeded the defenses around Hanoi during the Vietnam War. Iraqi operators had Soviet-made SA-2, SA-3, SA-6 and SA-8 missile systems, along with radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of troops with shoulder-fired missiles. Yet the Tomahawks flew through this defensive network in daylight, their low-altitude flight profiles making them difficult targets for systems designed to engage high-flying aircraft. The Iraqi military reportedly shot down 2 Tomahawks during the campaign, and possibly as many as 6 according to some accounts, but the overwhelming majority reached their targets. The television coverage of Tomahawk strikes on Baghdad, broadcast live by CNN correspondents in the city, created both opportunities and problems for American military planners. The images of cruise missiles flying down city streets at building height, visible from hotel windows, provided dramatic evidence of American precision and technological capability. But they also raised concerns in Washington about the political implications of conducting daylight strikes in downtown areas. The possibility of civilian casualties or collateral damage, broadcast live to global audiences, led to restrictions on Tomahawk use as the campaign progressed. The tension between military effectiveness and media coverage would become a recurring theme in American military operations over the following decades. Soviet military theorists studying the Desert Storm campaign focused extensively on the question of how American forces had achieved such comprehensive battlefield awareness. The ability to detect Iraqi Scud launches within 30 seconds, track mobile targets across open desert, coordinate strikes by dozens of aircraft against multiple targets simultaneously, all required information systems that the Soviet military had not fielded. American satellite reconnaissance provided continuous coverage of Iraqi territory. E-3 ADWACS aircraft tracked every aircraft in Iraqi airspace. Joint STARS radar aircraft monitored ground movements. Signals intelligence platforms intercepted Iraqi communications. All of this information flowed through networks that allowed commanders to maintain what American doctrine called situational awareness, a comprehensive understanding of battlefield conditions that enabled rapid decision-making. The reconnaissance strike complexes that Major General Ivan Vorobyev had envisioned in the 1980s had been realized by American forces in Desert Storm. The practical testing of these systems under combat conditions, as Soviet analysts noted, had demonstrated their effectiveness and provided American forces with operational experience that would be impossible to match without similar combat testing. The Soviet Union would never have the opportunity to test its own concepts in comparable circumstances. Within a year of Desert Storm's conclusion, the Soviet Union would cease to exist, and Russian forces would spend the following decades struggling with limited budgets and attempting to modernize equipment that had fallen further behind Western standards. The total number of Tomahawks fired during Desert Storm, 288, represented a significant fraction of the Navy's inventory at the time. The missiles were expensive to produce and could not be replaced quickly, but the strategic impact of their use exceeded their tactical effects on specific targets. Every Soviet military officer, every foreign government, every potential adversary had watched those missiles fly through the streets of Baghdad on live television and had reached the same conclusion. The United States possessed a capability to strike targets anywhere in the world with precision that could not be defended against using conventional air defense systems. This realization changed calculations about military confrontation with the United States and created deterrent effects that extended far beyond the Persian Gulf. The subsequent evolution of the Tomahawk system would address many of the limitations identified during Desert Storm. Block 3 missiles introduced GPS navigation in March 1993, eliminating dependence on terrain features for accurate navigation and allowing strikes in featureless desert terrain where TERCOM struggled. Block 4 missiles introduced in 2004 added in-flight retargeting capability, allowing missiles to loiter over battlefields and strike emerging targets or redirect to alternate targets if primary targets were already destroyed. These missiles also included two-way data links and battle damage assessment cameras, transforming the Tomahawk from a pre-programmed weapon into a flexible strike system that could be controlled throughout its flight. The ranges achieved by later Tomahawk variants would exceed anything demonstrated in Desert Storm. Block 5 missiles, developed in the 2020s, achieved ranges exceeding 1,800 kilometers and incorporated improved countermeasures against evolving air defense systems. The per-unit cost remained high, approaching $2 million in inflation-adjusted terms, but the capability represented by each missile justified the expense in American military planning. A single submarine carrying dozens of Tomahawks could hold at risk an entire nation's critical infrastructure, creating strategic leverage that no previous conventional weapon system had achieved. The Soviet dismissal of American precision weapons before Desert Storm had been based partly on reasonable technical skepticism and partly on wishful thinking that avoided confronting uncomfortable realities about the growing technological gap between the superpowers. Soviet engineers understood guidance principles, they understood the value of accuracy, and they had attempted to develop their own precision systems. But the combination of economic constraints, industrial limitations, doctrinal preferences for mass over precision, and the complexity of integrating multiple technologies into operational weapons had prevented the Soviet Union from matching American capabilities. The margin of superiority that the United States demonstrated in Desert Storm was not the result of one or two technological breakthroughs but of systematic advantages across entire industries, from microelectronics to precision manufacturing to software development. The human dimension of the Tomahawk strikes resonated beyond the technical details. American sailors who had trained for years on weapons systems they had never used in combat finally had the opportunity to demonstrate their effectiveness. The weapons officers aboard USS San Jacinto, who programmed the first missile, the submarine crews who loaded Tomahawks into torpedo tubes, the mission planners who spent weeks developing flight routes, all had their professional competence validated by the strikes on Baghdad. For Soviet military personnel watching from Moscow, the experience was more troubling. Officers who had spent their careers preparing to fight NATO forces in Central Europe realized that the weapons and tactics they had trained with would be inadequate against the precision systems the Americans had deployed. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond professional concerns to questions of national prestige and military identity. The cost comparisons between precision and unguided weapons continued to generate debate long after Desert Storm ended. American forces had used an average of 11 tons of guided munitions per target, compared to 44 tons of unguided munitions per target. The ratio suggested that precision weapons were 4 times more efficient, but this simple calculation overlooked many factors. Guided munitions required clear weather for laser designation in many cases, limiting when they could be used. They required sophisticated targeting pods and trained operators. They cost orders of magnitude more than conventional bombs. The aircraft that delivered them needed to operate in environments where they could designate targets without being shot down. All of these factors made precision weapons valuable but not universally applicable. The Tomahawk avoided many of these limitations by being a standoff weapon that required no aircraft over the target. The missile could be fired in any weather, day or night, and would navigate to its target autonomously. The launch platform remained hundreds of miles from hostile territory, safe from counterattack. These advantages made the Tomahawk strategically valuable even if its per-target cost was high. The ability to strike without risking pilots, without requiring air superiority, without depending on weather or time of day, created options for military planners that had not existed before. Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, who commanded the air campaign during Desert Storm, later noted that the Tomahawk was the only weapon system that could be used to attack central Baghdad in daylight during the first days of the war. The political leadership wanted visible strikes on the Iraqi capital to demonstrate American resolve, but the air defense environment made manned aircraft missions extremely risky. The Tomahawk provided a solution, striking targets in downtown Baghdad while coalition aircraft focused on suppressing air defenses in other areas. This operational flexibility, the ability to conduct specific types of missions that would be too dangerous or too difficult for other systems, justified the weapon's existence regardless of cost per target calculations. General Norman Schwarzkopf, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command, used the Tomahawk strikes as part of a broader campaign strategy that emphasized simultaneity and shock. Rather than systematically suppressing air defenses and then escalating to strikes on strategic targets, Schwarzkopf ordered attacks on Iraqi leadership, communications, command facilities, and key infrastructure in the opening hours of the war. The Tomahawks were crucial to this approach because they could strike heavily defended targets in Baghdad while aircraft attacked elsewhere. The effect was to overwhelm Iraqi decision-making processes and create the impression that American forces could strike anywhere at any time. The 100,000 sorties flown during Desert Storm, delivering 88,500 tons of bombs, represented a scale of air operations that dwarfed any conflict since World War II. Within this massive campaign, the 288 Tomahawks were a small fraction of total strikes, but a crucial element of the opening phases. The missiles demonstrated capabilities that air-delivered weapons could not match, and created effects that influenced Soviet military thinking more profoundly than the statistics suggested. The psychological impact of watching missiles navigate themselves to targets in the heart of a defended city, launched from ships that were over the horizon and out of reach, created an impression of technological omnipotence that no amount of traditional bombing could have achieved. The legacy of the Tomahawk strikes in Desert Storm extended through subsequent decades of American military operations. Between the end of Desert Storm in February 1991 and late 2001, the United States fired approximately 1,100 Tomahawks in various operations worldwide. In the 2003 invasion of Iraq, coalition forces launched 802 Tomahawks in the opening days, demonstrating that the weapon had become a standard tool for initiating large-scale military operations. The missile's evolution continued through Block 4 and Block 5 variants, each generation adding capabilities that made the system more flexible and more effective. The question of whether Soviet dismissal of American precision weapons was genuine skepticism or defensive posturing remained difficult to answer. Soviet military literature from the 1980s showed awareness of Western precision weapon development and concern about its implications. Marshal Ogarkov's warnings about revolution in military affairs demonstrated that some Soviet officers understood the threat, but the broader Soviet military establishment had not acted on these warnings with the urgency they deserved, suggesting that either the leadership did not fully believe the warnings or lacked the resources to respond effectively. The economic constraints facing the Soviet Union by the late 1980s limited options for expensive weapons development, regardless of threat assessments. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, just 10 months after Desert Storm ended, meant that the Soviet military never had the opportunity to respond to the lessons of the Gulf War. The Russian military that emerged from the Soviet collapse inherited equipment, doctrine and personnel from the Soviet system but operated with a fraction of the budget. Russian military modernization efforts in the 1990s were severely constrained by economic crisis. By the time Russian military capabilities began to recover in the 2000s, American precision strike capabilities had advanced another generation beyond what had been demonstrated in Desert Storm. The ultimate irony was that the Tomahawk and other precision weapons demonstrated in Desert Storm had been designed to fight the Soviet Union in Central Europe, but were never used against that intended target. The weapons were developed, tested, and deployed to deter Soviet aggression and to provide NATO with capabilities to counter Soviet numerical superiority. By the time they were used in combat, the Soviet Union was in its final year of existence, and the target was Iraq, a Soviet client state equipped with Soviet weapons. The strategic purpose of the weapons, to deter and if necessary defeat Soviet forces, was achieved without ever firing them in the conflict for which they were designed. Whether this represented success or waste depended on whether one valued deterrence as much as combat effectiveness. The sailors aboard USS San Jacinto who fired the first Tomahawk in combat probably understood that they were participating in a historic moment, the first use of a weapon system that would define American military power for decades. The Soviet analysts in Moscow who watched the missiles fly through Baghdad understood that they were witnessing the end of an era when Soviet military power could claim parity with American capabilities. The engineers and program managers who had spent 2 decades developing the Tomahawk saw validation of their work, but also understood that precision strike was only the beginning of a broader transformation in warfare. The Iraqi defenders trying to shoot down missiles flying 50 feet above the ground at 500 miles per hour understood that they faced weapons against which their Soviet-supplied defenses were inadequate. The meaning of Desert Storm for the Cold War's end was complex and contested. The conflict occurred after the Berlin Wall had fallen, after German reunification, after the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, but before the Soviet Union itself had formally ceased to exist. It was both a post-Cold War conflict, fought against a regional power rather than a superpower, and a Cold War validation, demonstrating the superiority of systems and doctrines developed to fight the Soviet Union. The precision weapons that devastated Iraqi forces in 1991 were the same weapons that had helped convince Soviet leaders in the 1980s that they could not win an arms race against the United States. The industrial capacity that produced Tomahawk missiles in quantity, the satellite networks that provided targeting data, the computer systems that integrated reconnaissance with strike, the training programs that created proficient operators, the defense budget that funded everything, all represented systemic advantages that the Soviet Union could not match. Desert Storm made these advantages visible in ways that peacetime deployments and exercises never could. Soviet military officers had studied American capabilities through intelligence reports and technical analysis, but watching those capabilities employed in combat against Soviet-equipped forces provided visceral confirmation of what the numbers had been suggesting for years. The revolution in military affairs that Marshal Ogarkov had warned about in the early 1980s had materialized by January 1991. Conventional weapons were achieving effects that previously required nuclear weapons. Reconnaissance and strike were being integrated into systems that could find and destroy targets in near real time. Information technology was transforming the conduct of warfare in fundamental ways. The Soviet Union had recognized these trends but had been unable to match them, constrained by economic limits and technological gaps that widened rather than narrowed through the 1980s. By the time Desert Storm demonstrated the full implications of these developments, the Soviet system was already collapsing under accumulated stresses that extended far beyond military technology. The Tomahawk missile that struck Baghdad at 02:38 on January 17th was more than a weapon. It was a message, delivered with extraordinary precision, that American military technology had achieved capabilities that no other nation could match. The message was received by Soviet military observers, by potential adversaries around the world, by American allies uncertain about continued American commitment after the Cold War's end. The 42-day campaign that followed reinforced that message with 100,000 sorties and 88,000 tons of ordnance, but the opening salvo of 52 cruise missiles navigating themselves hundreds of miles to strike the enemy capital captured the essential reality. American military power in 1991 combined reach, precision, and technological sophistication at a level that marked a clear break from everything that had come before. If you found this examination of Cold War technology and its legacy compelling, consider subscribing for more detailed analyses of the systems, strategies, and human stories that defined the decades-long competition between superpowers. The archive covers everything from submarine warfare to satellite reconnaissance, from strategic doctrine to tactical innovation, all exploring how American technological and industrial advantages shaped the conflict's ultimate resolution.